to join us tonight can still get this important education. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. It looks like our final panelist is going to be joining us here very shortly. All right, I will we'll add her as she comes in. So our first panelist for tonight is Dr. Chelsea Griffiths. I'll go ahead and I'll introduce each one of these folks, and then they can share an overview with you, and then we'll have time for questions. So as you are listening, I really welcome, I invite you to type out your questions in the chat box, and I'll make sure that they get to our panelists. So Chelsea Griffiths is an associate lecturer in the Department of History, where she teaches courses on the history of women, ethnicity and immigration, and the LGBTQ community. You can take this class with her next semester. That's right. She's offering a class on the history of the LGBTQ community, or rather histories, right? History is not monolithic. So her research focuses on conservative women's responses to the Equal Rights Amendment of the 1970s and 80s. So I'm going to have to ask you a question later then on Mrs. America, because that was a show that I enjoyed watching. All right. Then we also have with us today Maria Bruno. Maria is the Civic Engagement Coordinator and Policy Analyst for the Coalition of Ohio Homelessness and Housing in Ohio. Sorry, that's the Coalition on Homelessness and Housing in Ohio. She works primarily in housing policy and voter engagement. She runs the Ohio Votes Initiative, which is a Get Out the Vote campaign specifically targeting underserved Ohio communities. She has a JD from Ohio State University Law and a bachelor's from the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you for being with us, Maria. Our third panelist is Angela Seiner. Professor Seiner is the director of the University of Toledo Africana Studies program and the interim director of the anthropology program in the UT Sociology and Anthropology department. She teaches courses on African American history and culture and cultural anthropology. Her presentations include Black Women in the White House, From Outsiders to Gatekeepers, Patricia Robert Harris, 4 for 1, Michelle Obama, First Lady, and she's also given commemorative lectures at the Toledo Public Library. In addition, she's a member of social and academic organizations that promote African American history, culture, community, and community development. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea Griffiths. So Chelsea, if you could tell us a little bit about the history of the 19th Amendment, what it is that we're celebrating, and all of that.
Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me, Angie?
Yes,
Fabulous.
I think you're good.
All right. I have been tasked with giving you guys a 5 to 7 minute presentation on the history of women's suffrage. So the first thing that I'd like to point out is that this history is far from complete. The history of women's suffrage as we study it today focuses a lot on diversity. Economic diversity, sexual and gender diversity, and most definitely racial diversity. And you're not going to hear me talk a lot about racial diversity because I know that Professor Seiner is going to pick up on some of those ideas. But if you want to talk about the citizenship and voting of Native American women, the citizenship of voting of Asian American women, I would be thrilled to tell you more about it afterward. So in this broad view, we're going to begin in 1848, all right? And in 1848, a good few years before the Civil War, in Seneca Falls, New York, men and women, Black and white, attended what we call the Seneca Falls Convention. And this is the first moment that we have a lot of evidence for of women pushing for that right to vote. And in this moment, as I'm sure you can imagine, women voting is extraordinarily radical, even conceptually. We were truly in a moment in 1848 where women were not legally equal. They had trouble with divorcing, getting education, being hired in the professions, even claiming custody of their own children, right? And so when women are facing these kind of legal inequalities, the idea of women voting for lots of people, I would even argue for most people, is laughable. But for suffragists, it wasn't, right? Suffragists recognized that they needed the vote as a way to tap into political power. Women had always had access to some sort of political power, whether it's signing petitions or writing to your congresspeople or writing letters to the editor. Before women got the right to vote, women are traveling the country as circuit speakers, talking about political issues that are important to women at the same time as they can't let their representatives know what they want by being able to vote them in or out of office. Early on in the suffrage struggle, women recognized the power of the vote. I have no doubt that some of you have heard of Susan B. Anthony being arrested for voting in the 1872 presidential election. If nothing else, you might have heard that Donald Trump recently pardoned her for that crime. And as historians have made clear, even the ones that are the biographers, the official biographers for Susan B. Anthony, she would not have wanted that pardon. She was extraordinarily proud of that crime. Now, even after Susan B. Anthony is voting, women begin to recognize that if they want women across the country to have the right to vote, they absolutely need a constitutional amendment. Because we know the Constitution is that one document, the one piece of law that all the states have to follow. And so in 1878, the first constitutional amendment to give women suffrage is proposed. And the problem is that immediately after this suffrage amendment is even proposed, there's a major backlash against it. And it's a major backlash brought forward by men, but most definitely also by women. There are some women and men who argue that women just aren't built to be able to vote. There's people who argue, women and men, that women are too irrational, that they're too emotional, that they are incapable of the kind of intellectual thought that it takes to be an informed voter and an informed citizen. And if you imagine women in that matter, you certainly don't think that they should be picking, at this point, the man who is going to run our nation, right? But at the same time, everyone knew that there were ties between the prohibition movement, the movement to make alcohol illegal, and the women's suffrage movement. And it was pretty much understood that if women got the right to vote, women would make alcohol illegal. And so if drinking is part of your ethnic culture, if you make your money in the alcohol industry, if you're a brewer, if you're a bar owner, you are automatically going to be against women's suffrage because it's going to take away your livelihood, something you enjoy, or something that your family does during celebrations. And then, as I'm sure we're going to talk more about in discussion, throughout the South, there are racist white Southerners who argue that giving Black men the right to vote in 1870 was difficult enough for them. And for these racist white Southerners, extending the vote to Black women is a terrible idea for them because they recognize that that would be a challenge to their own white supremacy, their power within the Southern United States. Now, due to all of these different reasons, the suffrage movement basically stalls until around the 1910s. In the 1910s, a whole new younger crop of suffragists come to the forefront. If these names make sense to you, Alice Paul, Ida B. Wells, right? Women who are deeply invested in the progressive era, interested in reform, and they begin to push for the vote to make sure that they get the kind of issues that they want. But another reason why we see the suffrage movement be successful in 1920 is because of World War I. World War I ends in 1918, and all throughout American participation in World War I, women showed that they were active participatory citizens. They sacrificed for their country. They served as nurses and behind the front lines kind of positions in World War I. And since women had proven that they were active citizens taking on the responsibilities of citizenship, they demanded those rights of citizenship. And the rights that women wanted more than anything else was the 19th Amendment, the right to vote. Now, getting a constitutional amendment added is really difficult, and it should be, because the Constitution defines all of the legal precedents that come out of it. After passing through Congress, 3/4 of state legislatures had to agree to the proposed amendment for it to be added to the Constitution. And think about the tricky math there. If we want 3/4 of states to agree that women should have the right to vote, that means industrial states and agricultural states, northern states and southern states, East Coast and West Coast. It's genuinely a US coalition. In August of 1920, Tennessee became the last state necessary to ratify the amendment, and on August 26, 1920, it was officially added to the Constitution. I'm sure many of you know that August 26th now, we have deemed it Women's Equality Day. I always make sure to celebrate Women's Equality Day. Now, what I hope we continue in our discussion, in our Q&A, is the idea that white women across the country absolutely began to vote. But if you were a woman of color, you knew that the struggle was far from over. Especially if you were a Black woman in the South, you know that Jim Crow is going to reign over your polling place, just like it had for Black men immediately after the Civil War. So obviously, General, crash course version, if nothing else, and I am so excited to talk more with you about this. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor Griffiths. Sorry for the feedback there. So our third panelist, Professor Angela Seiner, has also joined us, and I will take this time then to turn the mic over to her so that she can elaborate on the history of African American women in the suffragist movement and the extended battle for African American voter rights. So again, Professor Seiner is the director of the Africana Studies program here at the University of Toledo, and she's also the interim director of the anthropology program in UT, I don't know why I'm tripping on that, the UT Sociology and Anthropology Department. Welcome, Professor Seiner.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
But I can't seem to get my video on. So perhaps you can just listen to me and I'll try to get to it in a second. I don't see it up here.
You know,
I'm not sure. It was a little difficult for me to get in. So I'll just talk. How about that?
That sounds perfect. And then later when Maria's giving her comments, then you can keep looking for your camera, but we can hear you fine and we are excited to listen.
Okay. You know what? I think I found it. What about, button sponsor? Nope. Won't let me go. Okay. So first let me say thank you for inviting me to participate in this very important discussion. But I want to first, say, as I've been watching what's going on in Louisville, Kentucky with the Breonna Taylor situation, that the struggle continues, particularly for the rights of African American women in this nation. And as I reflect on the Black women who participated in the suffrage movement, I realized as I was watching the news today and the last couple of days that this is a struggle that has been around for a very, very long time. And the Black women who participated in the suffrage movement understood that the right to vote was a right much greater than issues for themselves, that it was about race and ultimately how the vote could impact the Black community. And so I looked at some ideas this afternoon, actually the last couple of days, and I'm just going to read a few things here. The lives and work of early Black suffragettes is a lesson in understanding the commitment of Black women to the cause of social justice, despite facing both sexism and racism, or being Black in a white-dominated society and female in a male-dominated society. Many of them were 2 generations out of slavery, but were bold and fearless in their commitment to social justice. Thus, they viewed voting not as a means of advancing their personal interest, but the interest of the entire race. The educator and suffragette Anna Julia Cooper captured this sentiment best when she wrote, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter, in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me." Similarly, Ida B. Wells Barnett, editor, anti-lynching crusader, and suffragette, when told she could not march with the Illinois delegation at the 1913 Women's March in Washington, D.C., and would have to march in the back, noted, "Either I go with you or not at all. I am not taking this stand because I personally wish for recognition. I am doing it for the future benefit of my whole race." The vote, again, was for a greater cause. And as racism became a wedge issue in the women's movement, Black women did not shy away from organizing and pushing for the franchise. They formed both local and national organizations, and through their churches, civic and social clubs, educated Black women on the franchise and its importance as a tool to empower and uplift the community. Again, Ida B. Wells Barnett. "If the colored women do not take advantage of the franchise, they may only blame themselves when they are left out of everything." So again, the vote being important, not just for them, but for the community at large. So, it seems to me that when the franchise was won in 1920, Black women who could vote, voted. And we know geographically in certain parts of the country, African American women did participate in the franchise. But as the speaker right before me said, particularly in the South, there was no voting for African American, for Black women. However, increasingly, again, after Black voting in the 1920s, what we see happening is that, in my estimation, the issue of race becomes more important than the issue of gender. So even after women received the right to vote, we notice that many national white women's organizations took up the mantle as well, that the issue of gender was not the major issue. Now it was the issue of race, and therefore they did not support Black women. And Black women were again fighting for the right to vote, and again not fighting for the right to vote as women, but also fighting for the right to vote as Black women. The passage of the Voting Rights Act then in 1965, it seems to me, to a greater extent than the 19th Amendment, ended the Black women's struggle for the vote. And so the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, African Americans assisted in that. African American women or Black women participated in that process, but they did not get their full citizenship rights as voters until the passage of the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so their legacy and contributions should not be forgotten, and we should never forget who they are. And we can spend this time and time after this naming some of them. I just want to give a few names for individuals to think about: Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, Sarah Redmond Parker, Frances E.W. Harper, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Nannie Helen Burroughs, Mary Church Terrell, the 22 young women of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Hallie Quinn Brown, Josephine Ruffin St. Pierre, Florida Ruffin Ridley, and Constance Ridley Heslip. And just as a point of fact, Josephine Ruffin St. Pierre was the founder of the New Era Club in Boston, Massachusetts, and her granddaughter, Constance Ridley Heslip, lived in Toledo. And she was the first African American woman to teach at the University of Toledo in 1931. And she taught at the University of Toledo in the sociology department a class on race. And she taught until 1942. And she and her husband lived here. And her mother, Florida Ruffin, who was the daughter of Josephine Ruffin St. Pierre, also lived here in the city of Toledo. And so remembering Black suffragettes is to remember the words of Frederick Douglass. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And it was their demands, fighting and organizing, that helped change the course of both the civil rights movement and the right for women to vote in America. And so I think African American women have been pushed into the periphery, and it's definitely time for them to be brought to the center of this discussion. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion for this evening. I'll find my video.
Yes, you will find it. Thank you so much, Professor Slaner. And I really appreciate you saying their names, right? Saying the names of Black suffragists who have not been taken up in history in the same way that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony have, right? Which is all the more upsetting given how we know both Cady Stanton and Anthony ended up treating Black women as the fight for the vote became racialized. And it always was racialized, right?
Yeah.
So, oh, hey, look at that.
Hi. Oh my goodness, I can see you.
We can see you. This is wonderful. We can see your beautiful face. Okay.
All right. Good deal.
Okay. So again, I encourage folks to type any questions that you have into the chat box, and I'll make sure to ask them. We are going to now hear from Maria Bruno. Again, Maria is the Civic Engagement Coordinator and Policy Analyst for the COHHIO. It's too long to say it out again. And she works primarily in housing policy and voter engagement. We're really excited to have someone who can speak now to contemporary issues with the vote. So Maria has a PowerPoint, so we're going to mix it up a little bit. And this is about to get fun, y'all, because we're going to see if Maria can share the PowerPoint or if I have to. So please bear with me. Okay, so Maria, do you see anything up there that says share? Are you able to, let me see if I can assign privileges. Oh, share documents. Okay. Do you have it now?
File option, no share screen.
Do you see it?
It might be, if you know how to do it already, I just emailed you the PowerPoint, but
let me pull this up.
Probably definitely be the quickest pathway to this. I am not technologically savvy, to say the least, but
okay.
I will pull things up on my end to start talking. So yeah, I work with COHIO is what we colloquially call ourselves to avoid having to say the long acronym. But if people don't know who we are, they don't know what the heck COHIO is. So the acronym helps, but yeah, it's a mouthful for sure. So I run the Ohio Votes program, which specifically targets underserved Ohio voters. And what we do is we really work. Basically, we work in the field of housing advocacy, and we have strong relationships with a lot of affordable housing groups as well as social service providers, which have direct, strong relationships with the communities that are generally hard to reach through traditional outreach campaigns. And so we take advantage of their points of contact by, training up their staff, providing voter engagement materials, providing assistance with voter engagement volunteers if they have an interest but not staff capacity. So we try to kind of match these folks and these communities with the resources that they need to improve and continue to grow the civic engagement of their constituencies. And I like to sort of think of our tagline as we give folks the tools to be their own advocate. So we're not in the business of telling people what to think or how to feel. We really are more in the business of just motivating folks to get involved and to remind them that their opinions matter and that we want to hear them, and then providing a space to actually present them. So, one of the first things I did upon being hired is I literally had a wall and a pack of sticky notes, and I went through in my brain the biggest reasons that low-income Ohioans don't vote. And there are a bunch that come up pretty frequently. And the reason that I'm presenting it this way is because when we think of barriers, we tend to think of rules that bar things, that prohibit things. But barriers can look a lot different than that. That is one type, but certainly not the only type of barriers that voters face. So the primary areas that I sort of identified are their convenience, their voter registration, exclusion from the process, education about the ballot, knowledge about what these offices do and how they impact their lives, motivation because they don't feel like the system represents them, resources, they don't have a proper ID, they don't have a ride, transportation in itself is its own barrier, residency requirements, they might be transient, they might have just moved, they might have changed their name. And so those are the primary reasons that folks don't participate. And so what we try to do is we try to line those different burdens up with solutions to them. So we try to eliminate as many of these reasons for folks not to vote as possible. So if, in the field, when you're doing this work, you do hear frequently the same themes over and over again that kind of fall in these categories. And so I just want to talk more broadly about what the kind of solution is to the problem. So, I've never registered to vote or my registration is not up to date. Provide them an opportunity to register. Exclusion, they won't let me vote or I've been turned away in the past. In Ohio, people with felony convictions can vote. That's a huge misconception. So a lot of folks think that they aren't allowed to vote, but they are. But also, if they had an issue in the past, if they didn't bring the right ID, if they went to the wrong polling location, maybe it was a huge hassle to get there and then they weren't even able to vote. So that can be a huge barrier. Education, I don't even know who's running or what's on my ballot. A lot of what we do is voter education material, explaining to people what different public offices do and how those public offices actually affect their day-to-day life. And we kind of try to translate politics to the real world. Residency, I moved or I don't have a permanent address. A lot of folks think that if you're homeless, you can't register to vote. That's not true. You can actually use, if you're staying somewhere temporarily, you can use the address of where you're staying. Or if there's a nonprofit that you frequent, you can get their permission to use that nonprofit's address as the voter registration address. One thing worth mentioning, though, while I'm on the topic of options, is that if you are using that option and you don't have an ID with address, you might have a more difficult time finding acceptable ID for Election Day. But if you vote early in person or early by mail, you only have to provide the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. So that's a really good option for folks who do have that ID problem. And again, that's back to the education. Do you even know that that's an option? Back to transportation, I don't have a ride. Previously, we've done statewide rides to the polls. This year, we won't be able to do that just because of COVID safety. We weren't really able to develop statewide protocols, but we are help facilitating that by when volunteers come to us and when groups ask for volunteers, we're kind of trying to put them in touch with each other so that they can independently make their own arrangements. IDs, again, we educate about the options that are available to folks who don't have IDs, but also making sure people know that it's not just a license that is, there's actually a lot of different areas. Thank you. There's a lot of different areas that, folks can use as IDs. So a military ID, a hunting fishing license, a bill. Some folks don't know that, and so they don't think that they have an ID, but they do. Motivation is a huge one, especially, as we move forward with the racial justice work and with the, continued wealth disparity. There is definitely a feeling of this system doesn't represent me, so what's the point? So a lot of what we do is focusing on the empowerment programming to increase voters' knowledge of the system and therefore hopefully their willingness to participate. One of the biggest, I guess my 2 strongest talking points are my two favorite metaphors. The first is voting is like riding a bus. If you have to go somewhere, you want to get on the bus that's going the closest to where you want to go. You don't just not take the bus, you just take the one that's the most convenient, even if it's not that convenient. The other metaphor that I like is that voting is a job review for your elected officials. But the other thing I like to point out is that, you know, elected officials pay attention to folks who vote. And I know that people kind of understand that conceptually, but when you think about how that works in effect, when there's a bill or when there's something that elected officials are deciding their position on, they're thinking about who's going to vote for them for that position or against them for that position. And if you're not in either one of those categories, they're probably not considering your point of view when they're actually going to cast their vote or take their stand. So developing a voting block is also a way for the elected officials that you already have to actually consider your perspective and care about it a little bit more, because they know that there is a consequence if they don't. Knowledge, I don't know where to vote or when to vote. And then convenience, I don't have time, I need a babysitter, I have to work, all of these things. Ohio actually has 3 ways to vote, early in person, by mail, and on election day. All 3 have pros and cons, so different ones are convenient for different reasons. On election day, you don't have to worry as much about transportation because you can usually walk or more easily get to your polling location. If you vote early, it'll have to be at the Board of Elections, which is far for some folks. If you have an ID issue, then the early in person or by mail is going to be a better option. If you have transportation but not a stamp, early in person. If you have a stamp but not transportation, early by mail. So different folks with different needs and things that they already have will choose the most convenient option, but there are multiple options. Next slide, please. So there has been a ton of talk about different rules, drop boxes, absentee ballots, prepaid postage. I'm sure you guys are hearing things in the media and reading headlines and trying to figure out what the heck's going on. And it's kind of interesting because after all of that shakes out, after all of the fighting shakes out, really not a lot has changed for the purpose of actually what's going to happen this election season. So right now, we don't know too much about polling locations being consolidated or eliminated. We have not gotten word of that. That also depends on whether we get sufficient poll workers, which is part of the reason we've been all so aggressive about recruiting poll workers. Drop boxes, there's going to be one per county. There's a bunch of litigation about it, but none of those are going to be resolved before this election. So there's one drop box per county. Absentee ballots are accepted. They will be accepted as long as they're postmarked by the day before the election or dropped off to the Board of Elections on the election day, and they have 10 days after. If they are postmarked, they have within 10 days after election day to actually get to the Board of Elections. And then prepaid postage is not going to happen in time for this election, but it also won't be banned for this election. So, you know, again, lots of arguments and nothing much has changed. Next slide, please. And then this is just, you know, if you're like, I don't know how to help fix this or, you know, protect our democracy, there really are a lot of ways for you to get involved. You can be a poll worker, you can be a poll monitor, which are folks that actually just kind of observe high-risk polling locations just to make sure that everything's going smoothly. Are there long lines? Are there people outside intimidating people? You know, are the poll workers properly enforcing the rules? All of those different things. And those shifts are shorter. So if you're like, I don't have 14 hours on election day to be a poll worker, a poll monitor is a good way to give a couple hours of your time. Elections ambassadors are folks who are trained up to speak about elections and voting rights, and we're actually recruiting those constantly. Our local contact, who I know is on this call, is Liam Walsh. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out to Liam, and he can provide more information and connect you guys with the folks that are doing this work. We also have Adopt a BOE program through the Voter Rights Coalition, and that is folks who are working directly with the boards of elections to make sure that as problems arise, they are resolved in a way that is representative of the community needs and what is best for voter access. Share the Election Protection Hotline, which I have on the next slide, and then help others navigate the elections process, both your personal network or you can volunteer with us. Next slide. Next slide again. The thing that I get most often is, you know, people don't know what they can do to help and don't feel qualified to do some of the bigger asks. So first of all, I want to emphasize that a lot of these outreach methods will train you. You don't have to know what's going on going in. We'll let you know, and we'll give you guidance throughout and support throughout the way. But also just being a source of accurate information is really, really helpful right now. We are dealing with a lot of misinformation. We're dealing with a lot of folks who have misunderstandings about what the rules are, what their rights are. And so being someone who can be the voice of finding good information and sharing that information and helping other folks navigate the election is really, really key. These are our phone numbers. They're available in other languages. Also, protectthevote.net. I emphasize net. ProtectTheVote.com has actually been bought by a political party and has inaccurate voting information on it, which is another thing. Another form of voter suppression is actually intentionally increasing voter confusion. So that's another example of a barrier that just pops up these days. And then 866 Our Vote is the other website. I'm not sure if it links to the exact same website, but it's the same organization working on both. I think I have two more slides. One is just about the handicap qualifications. You're required to have handicap accessible locations. There's a hotline that I included in the slide if you have a problem related to disability voting access. Next slide, please. I'm trying to hurry along because I think I'm stalling too long. So Vote 411 is our nonpartisan voter guide resource that's provided by the League of Women Voters. They send folks questionnaires, and the candidates answer them directly in their own words, and they publish those candidates' responses. So there's no spin, there's no added opinion. It is the candidate's word of mouth, what they believe in. So it's a good resource. And don't undervalue Google or local write-ups of different people and issues, because often the local media is pretty good about doing a couple stories about digging into the candidates or issues on the ballot. And that's it.
That is so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Maria. And, so it's interesting, right at the end there, you were like, well, this would be an example of voter suppression. And we did get a question from somebody who said, do you think any of these barriers are purposeful? Does the government want certain people to feel discouraged to vote? And so a question I'd put to you and to other panelists is, how does voter suppression operate? Even though we have legislation that says, hey, everyone gets to vote, what are some of the ways that votes are suppressed, and where is that coming from? Is it coming from I'm saying the government, but is it the government? Is it Big Brother? What is this? How is it operating historically and today?
I'll begin. Historically, at least, I think it's a little bit of everything, right? And especially if there's a group of people that others decide should not be voting, there's state actors and state policy that will certainly stop them from voting. But that's one of the wildest things that Black women experience after the 19th Amendment in 1920 is not only are there some locales like regional and local governments in the South that put in place laws, the same kind of Jim Crow laws that stop Black men from voting, literacy tests, poll taxes. If you've ever heard President Obama talk about gumballs in a jar, he's not just making stuff up. There would be 2 gumballs, and the jar for Black people would be full to the brim, and the jar for white people would have 1 layer. And if you couldn't count how many gumballs, you did not get to vote, right? But at the same time, we know there's non-state actors. Of course, the most extreme example is the KKK, and I'm sure I don't need to say more about that. But there's always going to be, there's fears amongst people in the Black community that even if you're spotted voting, even if you're not harassed or threatened in that moment, who's going to come to your house that night or that next week, right? So fear, intimidation, and the law can definitely stop people from voting.
I can jump in. I just wanted to give Angela an opportunity to answer too, if she had anything to add.
I unmuted myself. Yeah, I wanted to piggyback off of that as well. At the end of, after the passage of the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, African American males received the right to vote. And, there was another 100 years of Jim Crowism where there was a concerted effort legally, and I often tell my students extra legally, to keep African American males from voting. And those same rules that were put in place then to keep African American males from voting, prior to the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, kept African American women from voting. And watching one of the historical documentaries on the vote, there was one white individual, who was attempting to get Southern states to participate in passing the 19th Amendment. And one of the things that she mentioned, and I had to rewind the tape because I wanted to hear it again. One of the governors of one of the Southern states said something along the lines, well, if we allow white women to vote, what are we going to do with Black women? And her response was, treat them the same way you treat Black men. And so that said, to me that there was this lack of empathy, and also this desire to push forth the Voting Rights Act for white women in the South at the expense of Black women. So you have, these Jim Crow laws that were in place then and through the 1960s. And I was listening to a young man on NPR a couple of days ago, and he was talking about his grandmother, who was a civil rights activist and voting rights activist in the South. And she said, a voteless people is a hopeless people. Right? And so not having the right to vote, puts you in a hopeless situation. But when you have these actors, whether it's the state or individual organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Camellia, some of these other organizations putting barriers to it, it is an issue. It's a problem. It's voter suppression. And we see it today, even in 2020. I mean, just recently at one of the polling stations in one of the states, a group of individuals literally lined the polling station. And while individuals were trying to vote, they were chanting, phrases and intimidating individuals. And so it still exists even to this day today, if not as overt as it was in the past, but it's definitely still present.
Yeah, and I think I wanted them to answer first and provide the historical context, because that makes my answer easier, which is, there was a time when 100% of the suppression was entirely designed to suppress people's votes. I think more recently, as in within the last 20 years, I think technology has added a wrinkle to a lot of this discussion, because there are security concerns that just straight up just didn't exist 20 years ago. And so sometimes those are legitimate concerns, and sometimes those are a ploy designed to make an excuse for a bad rule. A good example is, we have folks who in some contexts have said folks in leadership positions in some contexts have said that they are perfectly comfortable with having absentee ballot request forms be submitted online. A month later, that same person is saying that would be a security nightmare. That's an example of, they're pretending it's security, but I have a hard time believing that, considering their position was different a month ago. And so sometimes, there are things like that. So protectthevote.net versus .com, I mentioned that. That's, in my mind, a very overt effort to confuse voters and give them bad information. And so, yeah, I think that's totally intentional. Sometimes it's more strategic than, well, I guess I would argue that strategic for voting rights is malicious, but I think others would argue it's just strategy as far as like voter ID rules. So for instance, a hunting and fishing license is a proper ID in Ohio, but a student ID from a state university isn't. There might be voter patterns associated with that made that rule a little bit more appealing to some people. And so that's, often how it looks, is kind of shaping the rules around who you want and don't want to be voting. And that is still very much real. But as far as being able to say 100% is malicious, I think that would be overstating it, but 0% malicious would be wildly understating it. So.
And we also have to remember that in 2013, the Supreme Court of the United States gutted part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And one of the things that they took out was the protection of, of citizens. And so once the protection was taken out, then you see states like Louisiana and Texas and Mississippi putting into effect voter ID rules, closing polling stations, limiting early voting. I mean, these are processes that are part of suppression, of voter suppression, saying, you know, who gets to vote and how they get to vote. You know, the early voting, for example, you know, typically African Americans, you know, because voting Tuesday is not voting day is not a national holiday, individuals have to work. And so it helps certain members of communities to be able to have opportunities to vote early. But again, these changes have had a tremendous impact on voting in particularly the African American community. Voter ID laws in South Carolina, North Carolina, excuse me, again, closing of these polling stations. And I think I heard somebody mention, you know, having one box for Lucas County to drop off your ballot. That reeks to me of some suppression. And so it goes along with some of the other things that have been taking place since 2013.
So let me ask for a little bit more clarity there, right? Because when you say that suggests suppression, why do you think that? Like, I imagine there's some skeptics out there who would say that's nonsense. You're being paranoid. But why do you think one box in our county is fishy?
I'd be happy to take that one.
Yeah, whoever wants to.
So I think the difference, there was a time in which I would have bought the original argument that LaRosa's office was making. So initially they had mandated that one and only one drop box was allowable for each county. Their reasoning was that if they extended too liberally the ability to have drop boxes, then the General Assembly might swoop in and actually try to bar that altogether through legislation. And so in an effort to be more conservative minded was like trying to middle of the road it, okay? Where this story falls apart is, you know, upon having a legal challenge and a ruling against him, which said that they should be allowed to have more than one drop box, he appealed. And that tells me that we've now moved away from this is a defensive legal strategy to this is an effort to limit drop boxes. Because frankly, there were counties that stepped up. Hamilton County nearly immediately upon having drop boxes said they were going to have 4, one on each side of town. Cleveland, Cuyahoga County tried to have a scenario in which they had precinct officials, one Democrat, one Republican, show up to different libraries at certain times so that folks could drop off their ballots securely without having to get all the way to the drop box. Both of those were specifically opposed by the Secretary of State, which tells me that they are not just playing their conservative hand for the sake of not upsetting, you know, the powers that be, but there's more of an effort behind it. So I think one thing to consider is how many people are in each county. I mean, and also where the Board of Election is in each county. So in Franklin County, in Columbus, which is where I live, it's on the northeast corner of town. If you live on the southwest corner and you have to take a bus, you're looking at an hour and a half each way. That's not nothing. So, you know, there's an access issue that is extremely important. And I think, frankly, that's true of rural communities too. I mean, if they live, you know, 15 miles from the drop box, they still live 15 miles from the drop box. So that is just, it's not sufficient. And given that there are boards of elections actively trying to ameliorate the situation and are being stopped from doing that, I think that speaks to motives a little bit.
Yeah. So given all these concerns, what is the most secure way to vote this year? It's a question from
So I
Emma.
want to say that I will argue very strongly that all three methods are secure. I have toured the boards of election. I have talked to the boards of election. In Franklin County, just as an example of this again, every single room that has a ballot behind a door has to be unlocked with the handprint of a Democrat and Republican election official to even open the door. And so like there are security measures in place that I think people never think about or realize. So as far as like ballot tampering, frankly, I'm not concerned about that because there is a paper trail and there are security measures in place. And I do believe we have a strong election infrastructure that can support all three types. That being said, the mail is the mail. So, you know, Dropbox over mailing it is definitely going to be, you know, zero risk to whatever risk it is to put something in the mail these days. Early voting in person, you're going to have fewer lines. You're going to have less likely that you're having an ID issue. But election day voting, you know, that will function just fine too. So I would say that it's about efficiency, it's about convenience, and my dog is disagreeing with me. But I think all three methods are safe. But I think go with the one that makes you feel most comfortable. And there is a paper trail too. I just want to point that out. There is a paper trail, so hacking and stuff isn't really a concern in Ohio as much as other places.
Okay, here's another question for our friends on the panel. This morning, before I left for work, I wrote a letter via ResistBot. Happy to share that info for anyone who wants it. But I wrote a letter to Congress saying, hey, are you going to protect democracy? I am starting to get very worried that there are people in power today who want to stay in power longer than the American democratic system says they can be in power. Now, what do y'all make of this? Should we really be concerned about this? Is there historical precedence? Is this the right panel for this question? It's on my mind. I imagine it's on some other folks' mind too. So throwing that out there. Do we have legitimate reasons to be worried right now about our democracy?
I have been thinking, oh, I'm so sorry. Whoever spoke first can go. All right, I'll go. I've been thinking about this question a lot and honestly, I'm sure that everybody who's listening, if you're showing up to a panel on suffrage, I imagine you've been thinking about it too, right? And as a historian, I get asked all the time, is there any moment comparable to this? And my answer, unfortunately, is no. No, there's really not a moment comparable to this. You hear lots of comparisons to the Civil War, but obviously we're a different country now than we were back then. But one of the things that I know for certain, and that I can give you example after example after example, is that when women's rights are threatened, women fight back, right? And so if women's voting rights are threatened, women will fight back. And if women's democratic status is threatened, we will fight back. And if women's reproductive rights are threatened, women have historically always fought back. So even if things seem bleak in the moment, and I would argue they do, history tells us that women always find a way.
Historically, I'm thinking of Franklin Delano Roosevelt serving 4 terms as the president, and then an amendment being passed that says you can only serve 2 terms, right? 2 consecutive terms, and then and so the rules we've had discussions in this country before about the rules, but the rule of law has always stood firm. And I am concerned, watching the news and listening to all of these discussions. And I'm concerned because I ask, where's the resistance? And don't always see the resistance. And we can speak of resistance, thinking about African or Black women during the women's suffrage movement. This is what they did, despite the fact that they did not have the right to vote, despite the fact that they were pushed to the side and relegated to the sidelines and to the back. They still educated, they still discussed, they still moved forward, organized. so that when the time came for them to have the vote, they would be ready to vote. And so, in listening to the discussion about, all of the barriers to voting, one of the major ways that we can knock down that barrier is to educate. That individuals need to be educated on how to fill out a ballot. Individuals need to be educated on the issues of the day. And, these are all important parts of what the Black suffragettes did, even though they didn't have the right to vote. And it's something I think that we should day in 2020, and as we get closer to this presidential election, I think some of us, we've missed the boat on some of these issues of not preparing individuals for what is to come and what might come, and how this is going to impact all of us. I think it's already impacting all of us. And I think there needs to be a concerted resistance to this. And one of the best ways to resist it is to get out and vote. And as Chelsea said, that's usually when individuals fight the most, when their back is up against the wall. But I think that we should always be proactive and not reactive. So when you're proactive, as Eleanor Holmes Norton said, you're constantly preparing for the battle. That you win one battle, but you prepare for the next one because you know that another one is going to come. We're waiting to see what's going to happen. And it seems to me that we should have been preparing all along because the signs were there, that these kinds of issues were in play. We put our head in the sands, we laughed about it, we turned around, we didn't pay attention to it, and now it has come upon us. That we have to, the only way, again, November 3rd, early voting by mail, voting by, in person, whatever the case may be, the American people have to get out and vote, period.
Angela, I'm glad you brought this up, right? Like, we always need to be preparing for the next thing. I have heard a lot of Black women in particular say, who's surprised that Trump was voted? I'm not surprised, right? Like, I wasn't surprised. This is what Black women are saying. And I get it. I also wasn't too surprised because I knew the white people who voted for him, right? Like the base, not just, okay, we'll vote for him so we can get that Supreme Court nominee, right? But his base, the folks who, frankly, the white men who feel under attack right now because there has been an increase in rights. Trump is the backlash. So what I didn't see coming was the fascism. That's what I did not see coming, was the increase in all around suppression. And I should have, right? Because what do they say? First they come, they keep coming for people and then they come for you. So
yeah.
So we get out and we vote.
Yeah. So like as a lawyer, I think most other legal professionals' alarm bells went off pretty immediately, frankly, following his announcement for candidacy. And really, it was clear upon him coming into office and not divesting from his financial portfolio that he really had no intention of following a lot of ethical rules, and frankly, legal rules. And there also was no appetite to make him. And I think over the last 40 years, we have seen that manifest itself over and over and over. And yeah, I think it is one of those, like, first they came, first, like, whatever, because now we're to now they came for democracy. And, I was doing election protection in Ohio in 2016. And so I think that the reality check that was 2016 for a lot of people has hit. And there is a benefit to that. We had a very small table, a very small team, a very under-supported team that was doing election protection work in 2016. And I can tell you with confidence that each part of those is increased tenfold because people are concerned and they're involved and they're participating. And that's what we needed then, but it's still very much what we need now. But our entire legal system, our government system, our financial system, all of that is a social contract that requires mutual trust in what's happening. And I think what disturbs me about the rhetoric currently hitting is that it specifically goes after that public trust. And ultimately, we are going to be faced with, who do you trust more, our democratic institutions or Donald Trump's word? That's where we're at. And we need to get as many people to side A as we can. We need as many people to believe in the process, to believe in the infrastructure, to believe in our general democracy and the value of it, and realize why it's important. Because if there is a disputed result, if there is a problem with the transfer of power, the default position is going to be, do you believe Donald or do you believe the entire infrastructure? Because that might be the choice that we have to make, and we need to make sure, like, we quote unquote have the votes to get them to the infrastructure part. You know, as like someone who does this work, I try not to be an alarmist. I really do, but like, alarm bells ringing. So I just that's it. That's all I can do.
Yeah, if I can echo off Maria for a minute, I've spent a lot of time thinking about and researching conservative politics, right? And I am a cynic at heart, so take it for what you will, right? But one of the things that I am personally certain of is that people vote with their feelings, not necessarily with their logic, right? And so one of the things that I think people who are against Donald Trump and his policies and the direction of the country is going, they need to vote with their feelings too. And what I mean by that is, one of my concerns is that we'll see a wave of complacency in 2020 like we saw in 2016. So if you are feeling anger about the world around you, vote with that anger, right? If you're feeling scared, vote with your fear so that you don't have to feel scared in the future, because I can guarantee you that Donald Trump's voters are going to vote that way.
And that's all right. So again, to think of the historical piece of this. So one of the things I've been thinking about is how, when I was in college, it was George W. Bush. He was in power, and I was part of student protest groups that were, getting Bush out of office. And here I am working as a professional in higher ed, and college students today are dealing with an administration that is much scarier than the one that I was battling as a protester. So, are we, and we've seen some other things taking shape across the globe, right, that resemble fascism. Are we going to see an increase in this? Is there somebody worse after Donald Trump? And this should be a nonpartisan talk. I'm talking about Trump, the person, not necessarily Republicans, right, but thinking about an increase in oppressive regimes, right? That's really what we're talking about here, is oppressive regimes. So what do you think? Is there something worse after this?
Yeah, I emphasize the whole, this is nonpartisan, because obviously my work is all nonpartisan, but I think right now the top priority is, regardless of any candidate or party, is to protect the institutions that we have. And that's not unique to Donald Trump. The same reason you were fighting someone different 20 years ago, like, it's not the person, it's the system. And so we have to be diligent about differentiating those things. It's not unpatriotic to criticize your president because out of defense of someone else's civil rights. That's a very patriotic act, right? Is there something worse down the road? It can always get worse. That's kind of my life motto in general. I mean, it can always get worse. It can. But it can get better too. I mean, we can clean this up. We can make smart moves and decide as an entire society to care enough about this to enforce rules. That's really what it is. It's not even about what rules there are. It's the ones that we have aren't being enforced. So, we need that to start happening.
Yeah, and we have to understand, what is your line in the sand? What are you willing now to accept? And I think if individuals are watching and participating in any of the protests, whether it was the protest that took place, right after the election in 2016, thousands of women who went to Washington, D.C., the Black Lives Movement, thousands of people across the nation marching and protesting, if they take that same fervor, that same desire for change, and march to the polls, we can change the system. It can change, but we have to also get people to understand that their votes do count. That you have, and that you have a stake in this democracy. That if it falls, it's going to fall for all of us. It may not fall for you at this time, but eventually it's going to, right? As Moeller said, they came for you, they came for me, and eventually when they come, nobody's going to be there to get you, to help you, right? So we have to also, engage individuals on the level of more, feelings and passion. It's important because that can fuel you, but also to really at stake here. And it's all of us. All of us are we may have all come different ships, but we're all in the same boat now, right? And so we have to engage individuals on not only the emotional level, but also on the practical level of what needs to be done and why you have to be vigilant and vote on November the 3rd.
Thank you.
Education is the key. Education is the key. This social media is so powerful. In a matter of 10, 15, 20 minutes, you can get 1,000 people in one location. So why can't you then utilize that same method to get them to the poll, and vote? I mean, we have to get individuals to the polls. I mean, all of this will be for naught if we don't vote on November the 3rd.
You're right. There's been a very long struggle. A lot of people have fought and they have risked a lot to get us the right to vote and to protect that. And that struggle continues. All right, let's wrap up. Could each of you give our participants a call to action? What do you want them to do after they get off this call or shortly after they get off this call? You might all say the same thing, which is vote, but let's a very specific.
First, I would say check your voting status, as well as your where your precinct is. Make sure all of that is in order. There was a wonderful, interesting little clip on the NBC Evening News last night on provisional ballots. And they talked about that a provisional ballot is really a zero ballot, that you complete a provisional ballot and it will not be counted. And so you want to be vigilant about where your polling location is, even if you changed your name or you changed, just make sure your polling station is secure, that you know where you're going and where you need to vote, because that's important. And remember, a lot of people died for you to have this right.
I have two things, because I think one of the best ways to fight this voter suppression is to encourage more community support. And especially in these weird moments of the pandemic where we feel so separated and the world feels so large and we feel so isolated at the same time. Check in with someone you care for, a friend, a family member, whoever, and make sure that they can physically get to the polls that day, or that they have a plan set up to vote, not just you, but help someone out. And the other thing I push everyone to do is to call or write to your congressperson and demand that the next president pick the next Supreme Court justice. Voting is vital, and it is a mistake to underestimate the power of the Supreme Court.
Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely would echo both those sentiments. I would add that in relation to knowing your rights, also know your resources. So 866 Our Vote is a really good place. One thing I want to mention too is that's staffed by lawyers that are nonpartisan, but also it allows record keeping. So if the same issue is hitting 20 different people at the same precinct, we know that this is a pattern. This wasn't a one-off. So it really helps for the sake of the election integrity and just follow up litigation that might occur, to have good record keeping in real time. So I would definitely encourage people to utilize that hotline. So that would be one. And my second one would just be make sure you're at least, I would say, assuming everyone on the attendee list is healthy and capable, I would say make sure all of your friends and family and your network are registered and ready to vote and have a plan. And then try to do one more assertive thing to get out the vote. It might be being a poll worker, it might be a poll monitor, it might be, giving a presentation, but just giving someone a ride. One more thing to facilitate voting.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Everybody, thank you so much for coming to tonight's event, for being with us, for caring. I invite you to take a survey that I still get. You know what? I've got your email addresses. I'm going to email you this survey. And I'll also email some of the resources that Maria shared, so you know how to get involved. So thank you to all of our panelists. We appreciate you. And I'll also follow up via email because I have a thank you gift I'd like to provide you. So take care, everyone. Vote. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.